Having established the emperor in front of a poor fire in a room on the ground floor at the end of the courtyard, I made my way to the ambassador's residence, which was near at hand in the Saxony palace. On entering the house, I encountered Monsieur Rumigny, one of the secretaries of the legation, who had been with me at St. Petersburg, and whom I was delighted to meet again. He announced me to the ambassador, who was not a little astonished to see me, especially dressed as I was, but who was even more amazed, believing neither his ears nor his eyes, when I said that the emperor was at the Hôtel de Saxe and was waiting for him. "The emperor," he repeated again and again in astonishment. When he had somewhat recovered from his surprise, he said, "How does he come to be here, your grace? How is the emperor?" These were Monsieur de Prat's first questions. "The emperor is on his way to Paris. We have left the army at Smorgoni. By now it must be in position at Vilna. The emperor would have been more comfortable here than at the hotel. He wishes to remain incognito. We are starting again at once. Will you not take something, if only a plate of soup, your grace? I am taking luncheon with the emperor at the hotel, but send a bottle of Burgundy there. His Majesty prefers that wine, and as he has been unable to obtain any on the road, he will be very glad to find a good glass. Is the emperor's health good? What state is the army in?" "The army is in a dire plight, overwhelmed by misery, hunger, and cold. Only the guard still looks like a body of troops. Monsieur Bassano writes of nothing but successes. Actually, we have beaten the Russians everywhere, even at the crossing of the Beresina, where we took 1,600 prisoners, as I counted myself." "Monsieur Bassano said 6,000. "The fact remains that we beat the Russians, who ought to have beaten us." "Why make out that we have taken 6,000 prisoners? And why in such grave circumstances, when it is essential that he should know the truth, write to an ambassador as if he were the editor of the Moniteur? The number of prisoners is of little matter, as we cannot keep them. What is to hinder us? How are we to feed prisoners when our own men are literally on the roadside dying of hunger? Have we suffered heavy losses?" "Too heavy," I answered with a deep sigh. "These disastrous results are well worthy of those who urged this war. What folly! Not everyone urged it. Not everyone has deceived the emperor as to what would happen. But what does it matter? Your grace will have justice done you now, for it was well known that you did your best to prevent it. As for me, I have not hesitated to displease the emperor by exposing the true facts of the situation in the state of Poland. I continually write to the Duke of Bassano, but he only replies by sending accounts of victories, which deceive nobody here. This country is ruined. It has been crushed." I stopped the conversation by leaving the ambassador to change his clothes and return to the emperor. He was all the more impatient to see Monsieur de Pradt because, being dissatisfied with him, he was anxious to show his displeasure. Ever since leaving Sirac, the emperor had grown more excited as the moment of meeting the ambassador drew nearer, and he repeated again and again what he had already said about him. For this reason, he did not alight at the ambassador's house, which I suggested as more comfortable and convenient for seeing various members of the Polish government whom he wished to interview. "I refuse to stay with the man whom I am going to dismiss," he said. "He has given me too much cause for complaint." I shall omit what the emperor added to this speech, and so often repeated in the access of his ill humor. He blamed Monsieur de Pradt for meanness, for lack of tact, for misdirecting the zeal of our adherents. "He has ruined all my plans with his indolence," said the emperor. "He is a chatterbox and nothing more. I have often wished Talleyrand here." The ambassador arrived just as these last words were uttered. The emperor received him coldly. Monsieur de Pradt came forward eagerly and asked out how his Majesty was. His words had the ring of genuine interest, but this seemed to be even less in his favor. The emperor would rather have been blamed, even criticized, and found fault with by any other man, and was ill-disposed to tolerate this man-to-man air of interest on the part of one against whom he was so deeply incensed. Perceiving the effect he had produced, Monsieur de Pradt became colder and more reserved. These preliminaries showed me clearly that I should be doing the ambassador a service by leaving him with no witness, and so giving him an opportunity of private conversation with the emperor. I left the room. But the emperor, by the same token, desired the presence of a third party to increase Monsieur de Prat's discomfiture, and he bade me remain. When I explained, however, that certain orders had to be given for the continuation of our journey, and that I had to buy him an extra cloak, he let me go, bidding me send for Count Stanislas Potocki, as well as the Minister of Finance. He added that I was to get everything ready for a speedy departure and to return immediately. I bought the cloak for the emperor, who suffered severely from the cold at nighttime, although I covered him with half my own cloak, thereby almost freezing myself. I hurried up the dinner and returned to the room adjoining the emperor's to send off a courier to Vilna and an outrider to receive us at Posen. As the door between the two rooms closed imperfectly, I could not help but hearing the emperor heaping his ambassador all the reproaches he had already enumerated in his conversations with me. He concluded by saying that neither his tone, his conduct, nor anything about him had been French. He reproached him with making plans for a campaign, with acting the soldier when he knew nothing about military affairs, and added that he ought to confine himself to politics and saying his mass. He had been sent to Warsaw to represent France honorably, and had not to make petty economies and lay plans for a fortune for himself, which would have been assured him had he performed his duty as he ought. But as it was, he had achieved nothing but blunders. Monsieur de Pradt tried to justify himself, protesting his devotion, his zeal, his regret for any errors he had committed, his desire to do better. He defended and justified Poland for not having done all the emperor desired for the success of the Russian expedition. He enumerated the sacrifices she had made, the forces she had raised, which he placed as high as 80,000 men. He declared that everyone was ruined, that not a crown piece could be found in the whole country. What financial help would have to be given if anything at all was to be done? The more Monsieur de Pradt justified himself, the angrier the emperor became. He blamed him for the incalculable consequences that must ensue from his neglect to call up the levies, and added that from the ambassador's own words it was plain that he was courting foolish popularity, that a clever man like himself ought to have seen and made the Poles understand that to prolong the struggle by withholding the means of bringing it to a speedy end would merely injure themselves. The emperor called me in. He seemed bored to death with the ambassador's presence. His gestures, the way he shrugged his shoulders, showed his mood so clearly that I really shared the embarrassment of his victim, who was in agony of mortification. I felt I should be doing them both a kindness by going out for a moment and returning an instant later to inform His Majesty that dinner was served. But he had again started his tale of reproaches and went on, now with vehemence, now with cold disdain, until seeing a card on the mantelpiece, he stopped suddenly in the middle of his sentence, snatched it up, wrote a few words on it, and handed it to me. All this time, Mr. de Pradt was trying to get in a few words of self-defense, casting blame on all the French authorities, of whom he complained bitterly, as well as of the generals, and so forth. It seemed to me that on some grounds his remarks were not without reason. This criticism of the military aspect annoyed the emperor still more. He would not even permit any comments on the operations undertaken by Prince Schwarzenberg. As for the tactics of the troops in the Duchy of Poland, of which the emperor actually approved no more than did the ambassador, he told him sharply that he would not allow a priest to pass any judgment on the matter. The emperor spoke of the defense of the duchy, which he considered would be a simple matter if the levies were raised, although the ambassador held that the country was unprotected and in great peril. The emperor always argued on the hypothesis that the army would remain at Vilna and that Schwarzenberg would do what was expected of him. He anticipated holding and defending the duchy by Polish levies and by a general mobilization. He even wished to cover his army quarters by a screen of those Polish Cossacks, of which he was never tired of talking, though, for lack of money, they had not yet even been collected into depots.